A hand shoved a suitcase across a wet porch. It tipped off the edge and burst open on the steps. Sweaters, photographs, a pair of reading glasses scattered into the rain. A voice inside the house said to hurry up. Another voice said the room was rented and paid for, so there was nothing left to talk about. An old woman knelt on the concrete and gathered her things with shaking hands. A dog stood beside her, ears flat, growling low at the closed door. Nobody came out to help. Nobody said sorry. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, 74 years old, and 3 weeks earlier she had buried her husband. Her children had just emptied her life into the back of a truck, but they forgot one thing her father left her on a cliff by the sea. What she found there changed everything. Stay with me on this one. 3 weeks before that suitcase hit the porch, Eleanor sat in the front pew of a small church in Bristol, Maine, and watched them lower her husband into the cold ground. Harold had been the strong one for 51 years. He paid the bills. He argued with the bank. He made the hard phone calls that made her stomach turn. Eleanor cooked, kept the garden, and trusted him to steer. Now he was gone, and for the first time in her whole life, the wheel was in her hands. She didn't know how to hold it. She'll be the first to tell you that. Her son Daniel drove up from Boston for the funeral. Her daughter Corinne flew in from Chicago. They wore black. They said all the right things. They stood beside their mother at the grave with their arms around her, and for one day, Eleanor let herself believe her children had come home to take care of her. That's what a mother wants to believe. Believe me, she wanted it badly. The morning after the burial, they sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd fed them oatmeal 30 years before. Daniel had a leather folder. Corinne had that soft, patient voice people use when they think you won't understand. "Mom," Daniel said, "we need to make sure you're protected. Now that Dad's gone, there's a lot to manage. Taxes, the house, Dad's accounts. You shouldn't have to worry about any of it." Corinne slid a mug of tea in front of her. "Let us carry it, Mom. That's all this is. We just want to help." Help. Now here's the thing about that word. It can mean two very different things depending on who's holding the pen. Daniel opened the folder and laid the papers out one at a time. Power of attorney, a transfer form for the house, something about the savings accounts so the bills would keep getting paid while she got back on her feet. He talked fast and warm, tapping each line where she needed to sign. Corinne kept refilling the tea. The kitchen was quiet except for the clock and the sound of Daniel's pen clicking. Eleanor looked at the pages. The words swam. Harold had always read these things for her. She wanted to ask questions, but she was tired in a way that went all the way to the bone, and her children were smiling, and the smell of that kitchen was the smell of her whole married life. So she picked up the pen, and she signed every line they showed her. She didn't read a single one all the way through. The only thing that didn't leave the room that morning was a dog, an old black and white border collie named Captain, gray around the muzzle, lying on the floor by her feet. Captain had belonged to her father. When the old man died, Eleanor took the dog, and Harold had grumbled about it for a week and then loved that dog more than either of them. Captain lifted his head while the pens clicked. He watched Daniel with those dark eyes and did not wag his tail. Not once. Eleanor should have watched the way the dog watched. Dogs know things before we do. Here's what Eleanor didn't know that morning. She didn't know that her whole life was worth about $400,000 on paper. A paid-off house on a quiet lane, Harold's pension and their savings. 51 years of two people who never took a fancy vacation, who fixed things instead of replacing them, who put a little away every single month. $400,000 in a folder, and she had just handed the keys to it across a kitchen table to two people who called it help. There was one more thing in her father's will that nobody mentioned. Not the children, not the lawyer, not anybody. And it wasn't worth a dime to any of them. We'll get to that. It matters more than all the rest of it put together. For a few days after the funeral, things felt almost normal. Daniel stayed to handle paperwork. Karen made calls. Alina cooked for them and told herself she was lucky to have children who cared. At night she'd sit on the porch with Captain and watch the fog roll in off the water, and she'd talk to Harold like he was still in the next room. She'd tell him the kids were being good. She really believed it. That was the calm before all of it came apart. The first crack came on a Tuesday. Alina drove to the market and her debit card was declined. Right there at the register with a line behind her, the little machine said no. She apologized, left the groceries, and drove home shaking. She called the bank. A polite young man told her the account had been closed and the funds transferred to a new account. She asked whose account. He said he wasn't able to share that information, but that the transfer was authorized by the power of attorney on file. Authorized. There was that word again, wearing a different coat. She called Daniel. He didn't pick up. She called Karen. Karen answered on the fourth ring and her voice had changed. The softness was gone. "Mom, we moved the money so we could manage it properly. It's being handled. You don't need to be driving around with a debit card at your age anyway." Alina sat down at the kitchen table, the same table. "Karen, I couldn't pay for my groceries." "We'll set you up with everything you need. Just trust us." Then Karen hung up. 2 days later, a man Alina had never met knocked on her door with a clipboard and a tape measure. He was an inspector, he said, for the sale. He seemed surprised she didn't know. The house was under contract, closing in 11 days. Alina stood in her own doorway and felt the floor tilt. There must be a mistake. This is my house. My husband and I built this life here. The man checked his clipboard, uncomfortable now. "Ma'am, the owner of record is a Daniel Whitfield. The listing agent said the occupant would be relocating." He lowered his voice. "I'm sorry, I really am, but the paperwork's all in order." All in order, that's the terrible thing about it. It was all in order, because Alina had signed it into order herself, one line at a time with a cup of tea going cold beside her. This is where it turns, because up to now, Alina kept telling herself there'd been a misunderstanding. Her children loved her. They wouldn't. Not really. But you can only tell yourself that so many times before the truth stops knocking politely and just walks in. She called Daniel that night, and this time he answered, and this time he didn't bother with the warm voice either. "Mom, be realistic," he said. "You can't live in that big house alone. You can't manage the money. Karen and I have families, expenses, kids in college. This makes sense for everybody. We found you a nice room. It's clean. It's cheap. Dad would have wanted us to be smart about this." Alina gripped the phone. 50 years of being the quiet one, the agreeable one, the one who kept the peace. And for the first time she felt something hot rise up in her chest. "Your father," she said slowly, "would be ashamed of you." The line went quiet. Then Daniel said, "The truck comes Saturday," and the call ended. Saturday came. Alina watched 2 men she'd never met carry out her furniture. Harold's chair. The bed they'd slept in for half a century. The good dishes. Karen had flown back in to supervise, and she stood on the lawn checking things off a list, wearing sunglasses so nobody could see her eyes. Alina asked to keep the dishes. Karen said the estate sale was already arranged. Alina asked to keep Harold's chair. Karen said there wasn't room where she was going. They let her keep 1 suitcase. 1. And the dog, because nobody else wanted an old dog that growled at them. They drove her 20 minutes to a boarding house on the edge of town and carried her suitcase up to a rented room the size of a closet. A bed, a chair, a window that looked at a fence. And then, the way I told you at the start, the suitcase went off the porch in the rain, and the door closed, and Alina knelt on the concrete and picked up her reading glasses out of a puddle while her father's old dog growled at a door that would not open. That night she sat on the edge of a stranger's bed and did not cry. She was past crying. Captain climbed up beside her, which he was not supposed to do, and put his gray head on her knee. She scratched his ears and stared at the wall. "Well, old man," she whispered, "it's just us now. And here's the thing." She meant it as the bottom, the end of the line. 74, broke, alone, thrown away by her own children. She thought there was nothing left to lose and nothing left to find. She was wrong about that. She had no idea what her father had left waiting for her on a cliff by the sea, or what it would cost her children to have forgotten it. For a little while, life at the boarding house settled into something Alina could stand. That's how these things go. You don't die from a broken heart. You just get up the next morning because the dog needs feeding and the sun comes up whether you want it to or not. She found small work. She cleaned rooms at the boarding house to knock a little off the rent. She learned which grocery marked down the bread at the end of the day. She walked Captain along the harbor every evening, and the old dog, stiff as he was, still lifted his nose to the salt wind like a young thing. She stopped calling her children. They stopped calling her. Weeks went by. She told herself she was managing. She almost believed it. One gray afternoon she was going through the suitcase looking for a sweater and her hand hit something hard at the bottom. A tin box. Her father's tin box that she'd thrown in without thinking on the last morning. Inside were his reading glasses, a folded flag, and a yellowed envelope with her father's handwriting on it. The will. The old man's last will and testament, the copy he'd given her himself years before he died. She sat by the window and read it in the fading light. And there, near the bottom in the plain legal language, was a line she had forgotten she ever knew. To my daughter, Alina, I leave the Pemaquid Point Light Station and the land on which it stands, to keep as she sees fit. The lighthouse. She sat back and let out a breath she'd been holding for weeks. Her father had been the keeper of the Pemaquid Point Light for 30 years, back before the Coast Guard automated it and let the old men go home. When they retired the station, the county sold off the keeper's house, but her father had somehow held onto the tower itself and the scrap of cliff it stood on. A crumbling stone lighthouse on a windswept point. No plumbing, no heat. Half the windows gone, worthless. That's exactly why nobody had touched it. Daniel and Corinne had picked her clean, but they'd looked at that lighthouse the same way everyone did. Rotting stone on a cliff. Not worth the gas to drive out there. They forgot it. But her father never had. Alina remembered something then. Something she hadn't thought about in 40 years. Her father near the end, holding her hand in the hospital, his voice thin as paper. "Ellie," he'd said, "whatever happens, you keep the light. You go up top and you keep the light, promise me." She'd thought it was the medicine talking, an old keeper's mind drifting back to sea. She'd promised him just to calm him, and then she'd forgotten all about it. Now she sat in a rented closet with a dead phone and an old dog, and her father's voice came back to her clear as a bell. "You go up top. You keep the light." The next morning, Alina put Captain in the passenger seat of her rusted old sedan. The one thing they'd let her keep because it wasn't worth reselling. And she drove out to Pemaquid Point to see her father's lighthouse one last time. Just to say goodbye to it, she told herself. Just to stand where he'd stood. She had no idea she was driving toward the thing that would give her whole life back. The lighthouse stood at the end of a dirt track, right on the edge of the world. Below it, the granite fell away into gray water, and the wind came off the Atlantic hard enough to lean on. The white paint had peeled to bare stone. A rusted chain hung across the door with a faded sign. Alina stepped over the chain, took an old iron key from the tin box, and after a bit of fighting, the lock gave. The door swung in with a groan, and inside it was quiet. Dead quiet, the way a place is quiet when nobody's breathed there in years. Captain went in first, nose down, tail low, and started up the spiral stairs like he'd done it 100 times. Maybe he had as a pup at her father's heel. Alina followed, one hand on the cold iron rail, 90-some steps winding up into the dark and her old knees complaining the whole way. She stopped twice to breathe. She kept going. She'd made a promise, even if she'd made it 40 years too late. At the top was the lantern room, all glass and sky, and the great dark lens sitting cold in the middle. And there, against the curved wall, she found them. A wooden shelf of logbooks, dozens of them, bound in cracked leather, every one filled front to back in her father's careful hand. Every storm, every ship. Every night he'd kept the light burning so somebody out on that black water could find their way home. And beneath the shelf sat a brass chest, sealed, heavy, green with age and locked tight, with her own name scratched into the lid. Elena Rose, her name, her father's name for her when she was small. Her hand started to shake, and this time it wasn't the cold. She'd found it. She'd actually found it. And listen, if you've made it with me this far, if this old woman climbing those stairs means something to you, do me a small favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like Elena's only reach people like you when you do. Now let's find out what her father locked inside that chest. Elena knelt on the floor of the lantern room and pulled the iron key from her pocket. It didn't fit. Of course it didn't. 2 different locks, 2 different keys. She wanted to weep. She'd climbed all that way and the answer was sealed in front of her and she couldn't open it. Then she remembered the logbooks. Her father was a careful man, a man who wrote everything down, a man who never trusted a lock without writing down where the key hid. She started pulling books off the shelf, the newest first, and paging through them in the gray light coming through the glass. Her hands left dust on every page. Captain lay down beside her and watched, and the wind pushed at the windows, and Elena read her father's whole life going backward, one storm at a time. And in the last book he ever kept, on the very last page he ever wrote, she found it. Not a location, a letter to her. My Ellie. If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you finally climbed up here like I asked. I knew you would. You always kept your promises, even the ones you didn't understand. The key to the chest is under the 3rd stone from the door, the loose one. I put your whole life in that box, girl, not the life you had. The life I wanted you to have if the world ever knocked you down. Take care of the dog, keep the light. Your loving Pa. Elena sat on the cold floor and read it 3 times. Then she went down on her hands and knees at the door and counted stones and found the loose one and pried it up with her fingers. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small brass key. The lock was stubborn, but it turned. She lifted the lid of the chest. On top was a stack of letters tied with string. Dozens of them, one for every year, each dated, each addressed to My Ellie. Her father had written her a letter every single year of her adult life and never mailed a one. Birthdays, the day she married Harold, the day each of her children was born. He'd written them all down. Things he was too proud or too quiet to ever say out loud. How proud he was of her. How he watched her from a distance and worried. How he'd kept the lighthouse because it was the last place that was truly his to give, and he was saving it for the day she might need something of her own. Elena read one, then another, then had to stop because she couldn't see the page. But that wasn't all that was in the chest. Under the letters was a false bottom, a thin panel of wood, and her father had drawn an arrow on it pointing down. She lifted it out. Beneath it the chest was full. Rolls of gold coins wrapped in wax paper, heavy as sin, dozens and dozens of them. Old $20 gold pieces her father had bought a few at a time across 50 years because he'd grown up in the Depression and never once trusted a bank. And beside the gold, a thick envelope of government savings bonds, some of them 50 years old, every one of them still good, still growing, patient as the tide. And under those, folded in wax paper, a stack of old sea charts and a document with an official seal. Elena didn't understand that last part yet. But a man in a suit would understand it very soon, and it would matter more than the gold. She sat there in the lantern room while the light went orange over the water, an old woman with a fortune in her lap that her children had thrown away without ever knowing it was there. She didn't laugh. She didn't shout. She held her father's letters against her chest, and she cried the way you cry when you finally know, after so long, that somebody loved you and never stopped, even from the ground. Captain pressed against her side and let her hold on to him. The wind came off the sea, and her father's voice was in every gust. You keep the light, Ellie. You keep the light. She carried the chest down those 90 steps one careful trip at a time, and she drove home in the dark with a fortune on the seat where the dog usually sat, and Captain in her lap with his head out the window. She didn't sleep that night. She counted coins on the bed. She read the letters until she knew them by heart. And somewhere before dawn, for the first time since Harold died, Alina stopped feeling like something the world had thrown out with the trash. She had a lawyer's name by 9 the next morning. His name was Mr. Coyle, an old country attorney with a gray office over the hardware store, the kind of man who'd been practicing law in that county for 40 years and had known her father. She laid it all on his desk. The gold, the bonds, the papers she'd signed at the kitchen table, and she told him the whole story plain start to finish, the way I've been telling it to you. Mr. Coyle listened without saying a word. When she finished, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes for a long moment. Then he picked up the document with the official seal, the one from the bottom of the chest, and he read it twice, and a slow change came over his face. Mrs. Whitfield, he said quietly, do you know what this is? See charts, I thought, old ones. No, ma'am, this is a deed and a survey. He turned it around so she could see. The land your father left you isn't just the little patch under the tower, it runs the whole point. 9 acres of oceanfront on Pemaquid held clear and free, taxes paid current out of an escrow your father set up before he died. He thought of everything. Coyle set it down gently. Ma'am, I've had developers sniffing around that stretch of coast for 20 years. 9 acres on that point with the light. This isn't worth what your children took from you. He looked her in the eye. It's worth a great deal more. Alina sat very still. And these papers you signed, Coyle went on, and now there was an edge in his voice. A power of attorney doesn't give your son the right to sell your home out from under you and pocket the proceeds. That's not management, Mrs. Whitfield. In this state we have a name for it. It's called financial exploitation of an elder. It's a crime. And with the money in that chest, you can afford to make them answer for it. He leaned forward. The only question is whether you want to. Now here's the thing you have to understand about Alina. A month before, she'd have said no. She'd have said they're my children, don't make trouble, keep the peace. 50 years of being the quiet one. But she'd sat in a cold tower and read letters from a man who saved everything he had for the day the world knocked her down. And the world had knocked her down, and her father had reached up out of the ground to catch her. She looked at Mr. Coyle. My father kept a light burning 30 years so lost people could find their way home, she said. The least I can do is turn one on. She smiled a small smile. Yes, she said, I want to make them answer. It didn't happen all at once. These things never do, but it happened. Mr. Coyle filed the papers. He hired a forensic accountant who followed the money from Alina's closed accounts into Daniel's, and from the sale of the house into Corinne's. It was all there in black and white, the way it always is when greedy people move fast and think nobody's watching. The house had been sold for $310,000. Not a penny of it had gone to Alina. The savings, the pension, all of it drained inside a month. When the certified letters reached Boston and Chicago, the phone in Alina's little rented room started ringing again. Funny how that works. Daniel called first and the warm voice was back, thick as syrup. Mom, listen, this is all a big misunderstanding. We can work this out as a family. There's no need for lawyers. Alina listened to about 30 seconds of it. Then she said, "The truck comes Saturday, Daniel." And she hung up. His own words, sent right back to him. Karen flew in and showed up at the boarding house in tears. And for a moment Alina's old heart nearly broke all over again, because a mother's heart doesn't know how to stop. But Karen wasn't crying for her mother. She was crying because Coyle's letter had mentioned the word criminal, and her husband had asked questions she couldn't answer, and the whole thing was coming down around her. Alina stood in the doorway of that little room, the same kind of doorway she'd been shoved out of, and she did not invite her daughter in. "I read the letters your grandfather left me," Alina said. "Do you know he wrote one the day you were born? He wrote that he hoped you'd grow up kind." Her voice didn't shake. "You can talk to Mr. Coyle, that's all I have to say." In the end, there was no trial. There almost never is when the paper trail is that clean. The lawyers talked. Daniel and Karen, faced with the accountant's report and the words elder abuse and illegal filing, gave everything back rather than stand in front of a judge. The proceeds of the house, the drained savings, every dollar returned with Coyle's fees on top. Daniel had to remortgage his own home to do it. Karen sold her car. Whether either of them ever felt one honest ounce of shame, Alina never found out, and after a while she stopped needing to know. She didn't move back into the old house on the quiet lane. She thought about it, and then she let it go. Too many rooms full of a life that was over. Instead, she took some of her father's gold and some of the money her children returned, and she did something the whole county talked about for a year. She restored the lighthouse. She hired local men to fix the stone and reglaze the windows and haul heat and water up that cliff. She built a small keeper's cottage on the 9 acres, close by the tower, with big windows facing the sea and a warm hearth and a rug by the fire where an old dog could sleep. And she had them repair the great glass lens at the top, the one her father had polished 10,000 times. The developers came, of course, with their briefcases and their big offers for those 9 acres. Alina turned every one of them away at the door. That land wasn't for selling. Her father had held it 50 years so she'd have something of her own, and she meant to keep it that way and leave it to the town when she was gone, as a park, so it could never be carved up and sold. She'd learned exactly what happens when you sign away the thing you love to people who only see the price of it. On the first clear evening after the work was done, Alina climbed the 90 steps one more time, slow, with Captain limping up ahead of her the way he always did. The old dog was grayer now and slower, but he made it, and he lay down in his spot by the wall while she worked. At the top she found the switch her father's hands had found 10,000 nights, and she took a breath, and she turned on the light. It swung out across the dark water, strong and white and steady, the way it had when she was a girl. A boat somewhere out on the black swell blew its horn once, long and low, a thank you from a stranger who would never know her name. Alina stood in the glow with her hand on the cold glass, and she thought about her father and about Harold, and even in a softer way now about the 2 children who'd forgotten her. And she wasn't angry anymore. She was just there, whole, home. She reached into her coat and pulled out the last letter, the one she'd been saving, and she read it out loud into the wind so her father could hear her read it. "Keep the light, Ellie. Somebody out there is always trying to find their way home in the dark. Might be a fisherman. Might be you. Keep it burning and you'll never be lost, and neither will they. Your loving Pa." She folded it up and put it away. Down at her feet, the old dog sighed and closed his eyes, safe and warm at last. And out on the point, on 9 acres of granite that no one would ever take from her, a woman that the world had thrown away in the rain stood in the top of her father's lighthouse and kept the light burning, the way she'd promised, the way she would every night for the rest of her days. Nobody ever shoved Alina Whitfield out of a doorway again. And somewhere out on that dark water, every boat that passed that point could see her light, steady and sure, telling every lost soul the same thing her father had spent his whole life trying to tell her. You are not forgotten, come home.